In September 1943, the Allies finally launched an assault on mainland Europe, striking at Hitler's so-called soft underbelly, Italy. I've already seen where the men of the British 8th and the American 5th Armies made their landings and gained an all-important foothold on the Italian peninsula. And in this episode, I'm going to continue to follow them as they headed north towards Rome. But if the fighting they had endured so far had taught them anything, it was that the Germans in Italy were far from being a defeated force. And to make matters worse, winter was coming. I'm starting my journey in Naples. Just 30 miles up the coast from Salerno, where the US 5th Army had made their landings, the city was a major tactical objective of the opening weeks of the campaign. For the Allies, this would be by far the largest city they had liberated. And the port facilities were critical in order to keep up the momentum of the invasion. But the Germans were not likely to give it up to the Allies scot-free.
The people of this great port city of Naples had already suffered terribly during the war. The city had been bombed 180 times just in 1943 alone. But now the Germans were determined to destroy as much of the infrastructure as possible. So life for the Neapolitans was just about to get a whole load worse.
After the surrender of the Italian forces on the 8th of September, and then as news spread of the Allied landing around Salerno on the 9th, the city of Naples descended into chaos. The Germans now found themselves in enemy territory, occupying a hostile city. In order to take control of the situation, martial rule was declared.
Colonel Walter Scholl took over as Commandant of Naples on the 12th of September, and his job was twofold. It was to keep the Neapolitans in check, but it was also to make sure that he destroyed as much of the city's infrastructure as possible. And that meant destroying the port facilities. It meant wrecking the electricity network, the water network, anything that could be used to the Allies.
Already devastated by bombing, Naples fell into further disrepair, the suffering of the population deepening by the day. Meanwhile, Scholl declared a state of siege.
People of Naples, as of today, the 12th of September 1943, I assume command of your city. A curfew will begin today at 8 p.m. and will end at 6 a.m. Signed, Colonel Scholl.
So one of those who was a witness to the events in Naples in September 1943 was Filippo Caracciolo, who was actually the 8th Prince of Castagneto. So he was an aristocrat, but he returned to the city on the 16th and he said, "Every step reveals to me a show of misery and devastation.
Collapsed houses, cluttered streets of rubble, piles of garbage. The people queue around makeshift fountains because there was no more water in the houses."
And he mentions that everywhere he looked, there were German troops, all staring at the Italians, the Neapolitans, with a look of utter contempt. The problem was, with Scholl's measures becoming ever more draconian and with the Allies getting ever closer, suddenly this was whipping up a kind of perfect storm. And what happened was, by the end of September, there was a kind of spontaneous popular uprising.
As the clashes between the Neapolitans and the Germans became increasingly bloody, Caracciolo walked through this square and wrote about the terrible scene that he found.
I paused to look at the deserted Piazza Dante. Its expanse offers a bleak spectacle of death, loneliness and horror. Wide patches of blood, here already shiny as it clots, there still very fresh, make the pavement purple.
On the 27th, after weeks of growing tensions, a popular uprising was launched against the Germans. It became known as the 4 Days of Naples. To find out more about this fascinating story and the history of the Italian campaign, I'm heading to an archive dedicated to the city, the Collezione Bonelli, to meet with its founder, Gaetano Bonelli.
So what was the mood of the Neapolitans in September 1943?
Napoli era una città in ginocchio. Era oramai una città che era stata stuprata, umiliata, sia dal punto di vista proprio urbanistico, architettonico, con i bombardamenti. Fu la città che ebbe il maggior numero di bombardamenti in assoluto, ma anche dal punto di vista del morale. Il popolo era ridotto a uno stato di miseria.
So life was already pretty bad for the Neapolitans, and then Walter Schall turns up on the 12th of September as the commandant of Naples and starts imposing very, very strict measures. And how does that change life for the Neapolitans?
Ci fu sostanzialmente un ulteriore inasprimento di restrizioni e questo ovviamente finì poi con l'alimentare ulteriore malcontento che porterà poi a quel sussulto, a quel rigurgito del popolo napoletano che, prima grande città d'Europa, cacciò l'odioso nemico nazista.
Gaetano, you've got this notice here. This is a German notice that was put around Naples. And this poster, this would have been all around the city, would it?
Questo è un reperto molto importante e può essere considerato per certi aspetti idealmente l'atto di nascita di quello che poi porterà all'insurrezione delle 4 giornate. È datato infatti 22 settembre, 6 giorni dopo ci fu l'insurrezione popolare. È la risposta alla mancata adesione della rappresaglia di 3.000 uomini che si sarebbero dovuti presentare allo stadio, lo stadio Collana. Se ne presentarono solo 150.
So basically what they're doing is they're calling up the young men of Naples for forced labor, and they've demanded 3,000 people turn up and only 150 have. And this is an act of sabotage and people are going to get shot. Fucilati.
The days were filled with deadly street fighting. Crucially for the advancing Commonwealth and American troops, the revolts stopped the Germans from organizing any defenses inside the city against the advancing Allies. It's estimated that over 500 Neapolitans lost their lives defending their city. On the 1st of October 1943, lead elements of the King's Dragoon Guards finally reached Naples. Thanks to the efforts of the Neapolitans, they were able to march in virtually unopposed. The 4 days came to an end, and Naples was liberated. But the city was a shattered shell. Now the 1 million inhabitants relied on their liberators for everything, from water to bread. The Allies had inherited an enormous humanitarian crisis.
You know, looking at these photos here, you can just see the scale of the devastation here in Naples. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, it is really, really trashed. You know, building after building ruined, piles of rubble in the streets, beautiful churches destroyed. And then look at this in the port. You know, you've just got sunken vessels where they were, blocking the port facilities, blocking the quaysides. And yet what's so extraordinary is that the Allies arrive in Naples on the 1st of October to this absolute mayhem, and yet within a fortnight, US engineers have transformed the port. And by that stage, 3,000 tons of supplies are being unloaded every single day. It's an incredible turnaround. But, you know, their priority was military build-up. And for the people of Naples, the suffering had a long way to go.
But whilst Naples was being liberated, the rest of the Allied troops were now advancing up through Italy on a broad front. By the end of September, to the east of the country, the British 8th Army were approaching their next main objective. The men arrived onto the vast Tavolieri plain. The airfields of Foggia were now in sight. And that's where I'm heading next too.
Well, it's absolutely amazing to have come out of the mountains and suddenly find this huge, flat as a board plain. It really is extraordinary. I mean, there's not a nip or a tuck anywhere. And of course, this is exactly why the Allies want it, because this is the only place in all of southern Italy where you could possibly house heavy strategic four-engine bombers. Because heavy bombers need long runways. And what you don't want to be doing is taking off and flying straight into a mountain. But here in this vast expanse, you can take off and fly off to your heart's content. And although there's already some airfields here, used by the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, there's plenty of opportunity for American and Allied engineers to expand this complex even further. It's absolutely incredible. And just so different from the rest of Italy.
The airfields here were a vital strategic objective for the Italian campaign. In fact, it could be argued it was the most important objective. Control of the airfields around Foggia gave the Allies two things. Firstly, a base of operations to extend the Allied air support umbrella, a great relief to the men who were fighting on the ground. But secondly, and far more importantly, it gave the Allies air bases that could tighten the noose around the Third Reich. Pressure could now be put on German forces in the Balkans and the German-controlled Ploesti oil fields. And now all of Germany was well within range of Allied bombers. The capture of the plain around Foggia and its airfields would leave the Germans with nowhere to hide.
Well, this area has long since reverted back to farmland, but this was once Lucera Airfield. You can see Lucera, the town, over on the distance, completed by the Americans back in February 1944. One of a number in this area, which was an astonishing engineering feat. This entire area really was one of the main, if not the main reasons why the Allies invaded Italy in the first place. And yet the extraordinary thing is when the British got here on the 27th of September 1943, they did so with barely firing a shot. The Germans had simply abandoned it.
Within a year, there were 20 functioning airfields within 25 miles of Foggia, the majority housing heavy bombers. Albert Speer, the German Minister for Armaments and War Production, later noted, "I could see omens of the war's end almost every day
in the blue southern sky, when, flying provocatively low, the bombers of the American 15th Air Force crossed the Alps from their Italian bases to attack German industrial targets."
The failure of the Germans to come up with a cohesive Italian strategy, even in the wake of the Italian surrender and the Allied landings, meant that 8th Army was handed this jewel of a location without a fight.
I always think that the Germans abandoning this was an astonishing own goal, but I think it kind of reflects the confused strategy at the very top. And when I talk about the very top, I'm meaning Hitler, the Führer. And his original plan was to abandon Rome and to defend north of the city, some about 200 miles from the Pisa-Rimini line. And that's still in place when the Allies land at Salerno. And it's not until the beginning of October that Kesselring is told to keep defending south of Rome. And this is the irony, because actually, at the time that the Foggia airfields are abandoned, at the end of September 1943, there are loads of German troops in Italy. It's just that they were all in the north of the country, not in the south. It was a massive strategic blunder.
With Foggia and Naples liberated, coupled with the Italian surrender in early September, one main Allied objective remained: the capture of Rome. Allied planners were desperate to seize the city before Christmas. They already controlled almost a third of Italy. Surely the push to Rome would be just as fast. To do it, they devised a pincer strategy. The US Fifth Army under Mark Clark would drive up the west coast, north from Naples, through the Liri Valley and arrive at Rome from the south. The British Eighth Army, under Bernard Montgomery, would advance up the east coast to the city of Pescara, from where a highway cut across the country towards Rome, approaching the city from the east. Any remaining German troops would have no choice but to give up the city or be annihilated. And so, as September turned into October, the march on Rome began. The plan was a sound one, but what the Allies didn't realize was that they were heading into one of the worst winters in living memory. And now the Germans would be waiting for them. The war in Italy was about to take a brutal turn. I'm getting back on the trail of the men of the Eighth Army, heading northwest, away from the plains and back into the foothills of the Apennines, towards the tiny village of Rapolla Masani.
And one of the things that always strikes me about driving around this part of central southern Italy, of Molise and Apulia, is just how remote it is. I mean, it's remote to this day, but it was especially remote back then when you didn't have tarmac roads. And you know, these villages on these hilltops like here in Rapolla Masani, you know, they're just in the middle of nowhere. They're so far away, and yet the war spreads here as well. It's just incredible.
The new directive from Hitler to defend every scrap of land currently held by the Germans meant that it wouldn't be just major cities or strategic hubs that would now be fought over. Rapolla Masani and hundreds of other villages just like it, despite having no importance to the war effort whatsoever, would have to be checked and cleared.
It's fascinating looking at this Canadian film footage because it was shot very close to here, and one of the things that strikes you is just how spare and empty it is. The rains are starting to fall because it's October 1943. And you can see this landscape, just how difficult it is to maneuver around. And, you know, you just can't bring to bear all the kind of material might that the Allies normally have. The infantrymen were known as the PBI, the poor bloody infantry. And it was their job to just keep taking one ridge after another, one hill after another. But if you're an infantryman, you must be thinking, what the heck am I doing here in this remote corner of Italy? You know, there's just nothing around. You know, there's no Naples or Rome. It's not a place of particular strategic importance. It was just completely and utterly relentless.
Amongst the PBI marching through here was Farley Mowat, the young officer in the Hasty Peas who had landed at Reggio on the 3rd of September. By mid-October, he made it here, to Rapolla Masani, and was given the orders to check the village.
Mowat and his Jeep patrol arrived here on the 16th of October. They had no idea what to expect, but there wasn't a German in sight, no machine guns, nothing, and they were hailed as liberators and given spumanti. But just a few miles away, his friend Jerry Swell was leading the carrier platoon into San Stefano and was shot up and killed. They were ambushed.
The sheer relentlessness of the campaign, the random cruelty of the war, was now starting to take a real toll on the men, both physically and mentally. Mowat later wrote a letter back home about the incident. He was fresh out of Blighty, and before he really knew
what in hell it was all about, he ended up a pile of perforated meat along with 7 of his men. Why him? Why them? And when will it be you? That's the sort of questions you ask yourself.
It was now abundantly clear that the Hitlerian directive to not take one step back was going to be followed fanatically. Italy was now no longer just a fortress, it was being turned into a meat grinder. Kesselring ordered 2 defensive lines to be established, the Volturno and Barbara lines. These positions were designed to slow the Allied advance. Strategic demolitions, minefields, and the use of the rugged terrain would strip the Allied ability to use tanks and trucks, and would canalize the infantry into pre-prepared kill zones. If those 2 lines were punctured, then the Allies would next come up against the immense Bernhard and Gustav lines. These lines lay one behind the other, from the river Garigliano in the west to the mouth of the Sangro in the east. Together, they were designed to be virtually impregnable. But if the Allies wanted to get to Rome, they would need to be smashed. I'm continuing my journey up the eastern coast of Italy. It was through here that 8th Army would make their attempt to batter their way through the German lines and uphold their end of the pincer strategy. The Allied assault began on the 3rd of October. Little did they know it, but the men of the British 8th Army were about to enter into some of the grimmest months of fighting they would see. On the 6th of October, they managed to break through the German line. On the 3rd of November, the second line was breached. Then on the 9th of November, they reached the Sangro, a mere 40 miles from where they started over a month before.
So this is the Sangro Valley. You can see the sort of floodplain below and then the ridge beyond. In the previous month, they come all the way from here, from Termini. So they've crossed the Biferno there, then the Trigno, and then they're coming up towards the Sangro. And as the crow flies, yeah, that's about 40 miles. And the problem you've got in a narrow, mountainous country like Italy is where there's mountains, there's always rivers, and rivers always want to get to the sea. So they're cutting across your line of advance. So that's bad enough. Then you add the Germans, who are offering a pretty determined defence, plus all their demolitions. Then you add the weather, and you also add the huge weight of traffic that comes with 8th Army. You know, these roads are not asphalted, they're not tarmacked, they're not designed for vast numbers of trucks and tanks and artillery pieces to come pounding along them. And the net result is you're just slowing down to a crawl. And that's not anyone's fault. That's not Montgomery's fault. It's not the men of 8th Army's fault. It's just the way it is. And it's the challenge of fighting in terrain that so favours a defender and in conditions which absolutely mitigate against the attacker.
The campaign to crack the German lines had badly drained Allied resources, and weather conditions were deteriorating by the day. Rivers were swollen by rain, roads were churned into mud, and the much-vaunted air cover was grounded for much of the time. For the PBI, things were pretty bleak in mid-November 1943. But yet they needed to press on. There was no chance for a let-up. The goal was still to reach Rome by Christmas, and the pressure on the German forces needed to be maintained to ensure they couldn't be redeployed back east against the Soviets or to northwest Europe, where Overlord was due to land just 7 months later. The men in Italy simply had to fight on. On the 28th of November, the Sangro was finally crossed. and now the town of Ortona was at long last in sight. It was the key to the British Eighth Army's advance north. Break through, and the path to Pescara and Rome would be wide open. But whether they could break through was another question entirely. The job of taking Ortona fell to the men on the extreme right flank of the Eighth Army advance, the men of the Canadian 1st Division.
Well, the Canadians reached here on the 5th of December. It was raining, it was miserable. They'd travelled up from the Sangro through scores of ruined buildings and villages, potholes, and hundreds of German dead everywhere. Ortona is just over there. It's so close you can almost touch it, and yet actually it's might as well have been a million miles away. General Vokes, the commander of the Canadian division, his plan was to attack silently that night without artillery barrage beforehand, using 3 battalions, around 800 men each.
The Princess Patricias were due to attack Villa Ragati. The Seaforth Highlanders were tasked with taking San Leonardo. And the Hasty Peas were to secure the coast road leading into Ortona.
Farley Mowat of the Hasty Peas was told immediately to go and recce a crossing over the River Morrow down in the bottom of the valley and a possible fording place for some Sherman tanks. Went down there, fear absolutely tearing him apart. You know, he'd just seen so much action since Sicily and it was starting to get on top of him. I suppose we'd call it combat fatigue today. But he managed to make it, found a place, and that night, without any guns at all, the attack went in and the battle for Ortona had begun.
The Canadian 1st Division made slow, bloody progress up and down the steep valley of the Morrow. Attack was followed by counterattack, as both sides tried to gain the upper hand in the battle. After 2 long weeks, the determined German defence was finally overwhelmed. But what was left in their wake was a scene of abject horror.
It's pretty attractive up here now. You've got the Mayella Mountains in the distance and vineyards looking healthy. But this would have been an absolute hellish place back in December 1943. It would have been completely shredded, pockmarked, bloated corpses absolutely everywhere because it was very hard to recover the dead until after the battle.
Before the war, Ortona was a pretty unremarkable town of around 10,000 people. Its narrow streets bypassed by the Second World War. But in December 1943, the full shock of war was about to be felt here, as it was turned into hell for both the Canadians and the Germans defending it. Andrea Di Marco is a historian and author from Ortona, and who has spent his life studying the battle from both the Canadian and German perspective. He is the perfect person for me to talk to find out more about this terrible battle.
So, Andrea, where are we exactly? Because this to me looks like the gateway to the center of the town.
James, questa è la prima piazza dove sono arrivate le truppe canadesi, quindi sono arrivati praticamente da questa strada i Loyal Edmonton con il supporto dei carri armati del 12° reggimento, del Three Rivals. Quindi praticamente l'obiettivo era di conquistare nel minor tempo possibile la città per arrivare a occupare la strada verso Pescara.
So this is the road to Pescara.
Esattamente così.
So what German troops were here in the town, and do we know what their orders were?
Si era capito che la città di Ortona doveva essere difesa e hanno chiamato gli specialisti, i paracadutisti della prima divisione, che hanno preparato quella che è stata poi la tattica difensiva che ha accolto i canadesi in Ortona. Quindi i tedeschi avevano distrutto le costruzioni che poi hanno fatto delle specie di come dire, mucchi di detriti, servivano ad un obiettivo ben preciso, cioè quello di ritardare l'avanzata sia delle truppe di fanteria che dei carri armati.
So where are the Germans?
I tedeschi erano appostati all'interno del centro abitato. In questa palazzina c'era una mitragliatrice che controllava la direzione di provenienza delle truppe canadesi. Molti snipers, cioè dei cecchini, erano sistemati su questa costruzione, ma quando sono arrivati i canadesi qua sono riusciti a sbaragliare completamente le postazioni MG e gli snipers. Quindi è iniziata la conduzione della battaglia verso il centro della città.
So let's go and have a look at where the Canadians were attacking.
Yes, andiamo.
Ok.
Ti accompagno.
The assault on Ortona began on the 20th of December. The Germans stationed in the outskirts were forced back inside the town, but any hope of capturing it quickly was soon forgotten. One of the 1,800 German defenders of the city was Obergefreiter Siegfried Bär, and he kept a diary during the battle. At 2 p.m, the enemy began the attack.
We had to retreat from the outskirts of the town to a new position. Ruins upon ruins were defended desperately by us. The tanks were approaching, but our zeal for the fight did not waver.
So this is the main road that leads through the town and eventually to Pescara. And this is where the tanks are going, because this is the only route the tanks can go, because it's the only road that's wide enough.
Fino a questo punto è stato possibile avanzare senza alcun problema, ma quando arriviamo più avanti i tedeschi avevano minato le costruzioni che bloccavano la piazza e le avevano riempite di mine antiuomo, mine anticarro e un cannone anticarro sparava in direzione del punto di arrivo dei carri armati canadesi. Così fu possibile bloccarne completamente l'avanzata.
So they come down here, the tanks come here, they meet the rubble, they hit the rubble, they can't go any further forward. And then the Germans jump out and fire them with Panzerfaust.
Once again, it came down to the PBI to head up the slow capture of the town.
The Canadians hadn't really been trained in urban warfare, so they had to kind of learn on the job. And what they realized very quickly is you don't want to be in the streets, because all of those have been zeroed by snipers and machine guns and what have you. So what you do is you smash down a door, you go in there with engineers, and this campaign, above all other campaigns, was a campaign of infantry and engineers in a variety of different roles. What you then do is, once you get in here, you put a hollow charge against the wall of the next building, blow it up, in the smoke, fire your Tommy gun, spray the insides, charge in, work up the floors to the top, and then repeat the process going from the top back down again. But the point is, you've got to do that house by house, floor by floor. There are absolutely no shortcuts.
This technique, known as mouse holing, was bloody, slow but effective, and slowly but surely, the Allies pushed the Germans back towards the square around Cattedrale San Tommaso, where they would make their last stand. Christmas Day came and went without any let-up in fighting, but by now the German forces were down to the barest of bones. Siegfried Bär's 2nd Battalion, that entered Ortona with some 900 men, were now down to just 60. The decision was finally made to allow these final few men, including Siegfried Bär, to retreat. In the darkness of the night of the 27th-28th of December, the Germans finally left Ortona. Bär said in his diary, "In the middle of the night, in single file, we leave Ortona.
Heading north, stumbling on the slope of a vineyard, almost in the direction of the homeland."
the battle to capture Ortona had been terrible. The Canadians lost nearly 2,500 killed and wounded. A further 5,000 men were withdrawn from the battle because of illness and exhaustion. The 8th Army, who had spent the last 3 months relentlessly toiling up the spine of Italy, from their landing at Reggio to the capture of the Foggia airfields, dealing with never-ending German demolitions and rugged mountain terrain, the battle to capture Ortona left them utterly spent. Pescara, which now lay just 20 miles away, would prove to be a town too far.
The battle for Ortona was finally over, and already people were talking about it as the Little Stalingrad. At the end of it, 8th Army had completely shot its bolt. It could do no more for the time being, and so attention turned back to the western side of the leg of Italy and 5th Army's front, and the battle for Cassino.
Coming soon, I'm going to continue following the Allied path to Rome. I'll come face to face with ghost villages and German bunkers, climb into the mountains, and reach the iconic Monte Cassino.